You're listening to Foundations, where complex themes shaping property and sustainability are simplified. These are the grassroots conversations the industry needs to hear and understand. I'm your host, Amanda Paul from Brand Injection. Let's dive into today's discussion. This year, I've been exploring sustainability within the built environment. One point of focus has been on how various building features, design choices, and manufacturing processes affect the environment, what initiatives are underway to make these aspects more eco-friendly, and how these are being communicated. With buildings and construction responsible for nearly 18% of Australia's emissions, the equivalent of around 90 million tonnes of CO2 annually, understanding and managing this is critical for developers, manufacturers, and suppliers in the property sector. Carbon emission reporting provides a way to improve energy efficiency, reduce emissions from construction materials and processes, otherwise known as embodied carbon, and adopt sustainable building practices. Better still, transparent and accurate reporting helps enhance corporate reputation, manage risks, and build trust with investors, prospective buyers, and stakeholders. It also improves supply chain management, fostering resilience and efficiency. Today, I'm speaking with Richie Mulder, the co-founder of Carbon Halo, an Australian company specialising in making carbon emissions measurement, climate reporting, and emissions reduction accessible and manageable for businesses of all sizes. Hi, Richie. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Pleasure. Richie brings over 20 years of experience in project management, business transformation, and sustainability consulting across many industries, including property, mining, and manufacturing, just to name a few. He helps businesses respond to evolving carbon compliance requirements and develop practical, effective emissions reduction strategies by combining technology-driven solutions with expert advisory support. Today, in our conversation, we'll explore what carbon emission reporting means, why it's becoming essential for the property sector, and how developers, manufacturers, and suppliers can take practical, clear steps to meet with new regulations and drive sustainability. So let's dive in. So, Richie, for those who are new to the concept, could you briefly just explain for us what carbon emission reporting is and why it's become such a hot topic in business?
Yeah, sure. Essentially, carbon emissions reporting is a very simple process of measuring and then disclosing the greenhouse gases that a business produces. Now, that can be from operations, it can be from the energy that they use, or it could be from a broader supply chain. It's become a pretty hot topic because climate risk is now recognised also as a financial risk, not just to the planet. So regulators, investors, and customers are now expecting transparency around this measurement and what businesses are doing. Businesses can look at accurately reporting and then reducing their emissions. By doing that, they're better prepared for future regulations and they become more attractive to partners and to investors.
Okay, great. So I guess that kind of covers my next question, which is what's driving the push for mandatory sustainability reporting in Australia, and when do these regulations officially come into effect?
Yeah, the push for driving these regulations in Australia is really to the alignment of the global climate disclosure standards, and specifically the international standards. They're called ISSB framework. Now, this really ensures that businesses are transparent about their climate risks and their emissions. So in Australia, it's called the AASB S2, or another acronym, ASRS. So it's the Australian Sustainability Reporting Scheme. And the first wave of this mandatory reporting begins from the first financial year after January 2025 for large businesses. Mid-sized businesses are following in 2026, and then smaller listed entities or even private entities are in 2027. So they're progressively bringing in this legislation. So there will be an impost on business to start understanding the operations, the emissions across their value chain, and then reporting on them transparently or the best that they can.
And so, what stipulates what size a small business is versus a medium versus a large?
Yeah, so there's essentially the legislation has three criteria to qualify a business in a particular group. So it's based on revenue, assets, and staff numbers. As an example, like a Group One business, that would be a business that has more than 500 million in revenue, more than 500 staff, and $1 billion in assets. That's a Group One. A Group Two is slightly smaller, where it is 200 million in revenue. It's over 250 employees, and the assets are around about the $500 million. Sorry, $500 million in assets. Whereas a Group Three business becomes even smaller, where it's around about $50 million in revenue, $25 million in assets, or greater than 100 employees. Any other business that's below that don't fall under the regulations to report, but they may be required or requested by customers that they supply.
Okay. Okay, great. Um, and how do these reporting obligations affect property developers, building manufacturers, and trade suppliers specifically?
Yeah, so these obligations will typically have a large operational impact on businesses that have large operational emissions, and this will be from energy consumption or typically fuel use. And they will look at what we call Scope 3 emissions. And as you alluded to at the beginning, is that this looks at embedded emissions within materials, particularly construction activities, right? So the reporting obligations here mean that these businesses will need to measure the emissions pretty accurately. They need to then disclose them annually, and then they have to demonstrate a plan for reduction. So what that does is that impacts your procurement, it impacts your project design, and then it impacts your supplier relationships as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, and this affects businesses all over Australia, or just New South Wales, or is it different per state?
No, it's all over Australia. So any business that meets those that criteria around the legislation, they will need to be looking at undertaking these processes in order to report annually.
So, what I guess are the most common misconceptions that you've come across, or points of confusion where you see businesses trying to grapple with when it comes to sustainability reporting?
Yeah. Okay. I think a lot of organisations think it's about carbon only, and it's like, oh, what's my carbon footprint? But it's a lot broader. What we need to be thinking about is um, really understanding first, you need to understand what the obligations that you have as a business, and that's legislative or socially or environmentally. Um, Defining what the boundaries are of what is determined to be within your operational and organisational boundary of what you need to be managing. Measuring emissions is definitely one of those, and that is your carbon footprint. And that's normally the first step that a business undertakes, is because you can't really manage something that you don't understand the quantum of, right? So
Yeah.
you've got to be able to understand what you're dealing with first. And then from there, developing a plan on, okay, um, where are our hotspots? How do we identify practical ways to reduce these emissions over time? So you're not expected to do it right then and there or that year. You then need to report on it, but then you need to have that assured by an independent. Now, under the legislation, the AASBS 2 standards, there's a whole heap of other disclosures that are different to um, your carbon footprint. And that covers governance, it covers strategy, it covers risk, and it covers some scenario analysis and metrics and targets. Now, a lot of that stuff has to deal with at board level and at senior executive level. How are they taking responsibility? How is climate performance linked to their remuneration? Strategy is looking at how your overall business is planning to deal with in the future impact into your supply chain.
Mm,
Risk is looking at what are the risks around, let's say, for instance, under a scenario where we go above 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and 3 degrees. What are the impacts on you being able to get building materials in, particularly if they're coming in from overseas? How does that impact your supply chain? Now,
mm,
the key point here is that it's not something that's new. Like if you're doing your business plan and your business strategy, you're already thinking about these risks because your supply chain is inherently important to building a building or whoever your clients are, right? What this does, you just need to put a climate lens over it to say, okay, if we get a hurricane or in Australia, it's a cyclone, but if we
mm.
get really adverse weather, how does that impact our ability to get materials from A to B? How does that impact our ability to do this or that? So it's kind of putting that climate lens over the top of it.
Yeah, actually, that was going to lead into another question that I had. How does the location of an actual business affect the reporting? If a rural type of
Mm.
business versus somebody that's situated in the CBD or close to the CBD. Does that affect much of what they need to report or how they report or?
Well, it does it in a way, because if you take an example, if we look at northern New South Wales, where there's been quite a lot of flooding over recent years, if you're a decent sized builder that has larger contracts and it might be infrastructure, not necessarily housing or whatever it might be, you might be building infrastructure, roads, or other things in those areas. How does the impact of climate weather or inclement weather um, with materials? So you could have materials sitting there and then a flood comes in, washes them away. And you go, okay, well, I've now got to claim insurance, now I've got to do this. But if that constantly happens more and more, and we're getting more and more of these weather events, you've got to start thinking differently and like, okay, what are the steps I need to do to try and protect the materials that I've got sitting there? Will I
Mm,
have to lock them away somewhere? Do I need to raise them? Do I need to delay, or do I need to shorten the time that they're sitting on site before we do something with? So in a way, it does impact the reporting, but the reporting is only the outcome of the actions that you're doing. So you've got to do those risk assessments first in order to protect your business. And the fact that you've got to report on them, okay, you report on that you've done those assessments, you know?
yeah, right. Okay. That's interesting because yeah, you're right. All the flooding up in northern New South Wales, and then you've got, bushfires and all sorts of things that could affect
Uh,
materials and your actual business. So, and how does Carbon Halo help businesses navigate the complexity of carbon reporting, especially those who might feel a little bit overwhelmed by all the jargon? You mentioned a few acronyms
yeah.
before, so how does Carbon Halo help with that?
Yeah. So we aim to simplify this process a whole heap, right? So we combine, there's what we've seen in the marketplace. There are different models. You have uh, a tech solution, which you get access into a platform and you purchase a license and it's left up to you to go and do it. So you've got to become the expert and putting the inputs in to get the outputs. Now, the outputs are only going to be as good as the inputs, right? So there's an expectation that you're going to get the right sets of data. You know what you're doing. You know where to put things so you can get the outputs you need. And then you've got on the other end of the scale, you've got consulting houses where you approach a consulting house and I say, okay, we'll go and do all this for you. But then at the end of the day, they give you a report. Now, with that report, where does it sit? Sits in the shelf, gathers dust. You might use it, you may not use it. And then when you need to reference it at some point, or what is the data that I used to get that report? Where is that? And it becomes quite difficult. So what we do is we're combining the two. So we're a hybrid model. So we have a platform which centralizes all of your emissions related and climate related data. It gives you ability to manage the reduction strategies. It gives you the ability to manage all the climate disclosures and the rest of it. However, it's backed by our experts that step you through that process, hold your hand all the way through.
Awesome.
So you don't need to look at the legislation and understand it. Um, a business didn't get into business to do that, right? So they're
Mm.
there to build or do whatever they need to do. Whereas we
Yeah.
got into business to do that. So we understand the legislation, we simplify it, essentially hold their hand all the way through. And then at the end of it, they get their reports and their dashboards and all the other pieces. And it's in a centralized location where they can access that at any point.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And how long's Carbon Halo been operating?
Um, we've been around since 2021, so about 4 years now. And it's been quite a different journey. We started off with small businesses, individuals and small business. And then progressively, we've stepped up a notch, and we've now got some of Australia's largest brands and corporates working with us. In saying
Great.
that, we still have a small business product which is free, whereas our sweet spot is typically larger organisations and the ones that actually meet the legislation.
Right. Okay. Okay, great. And with so much technical language around emissions and compliance, how do you recommend businesses communicate these changes internally or to any stakeholders?
Yeah. Um, Again, it comes down to simplifying that language that's being used. And when we look at the use of plain language and the use of how that's impacting a business, instead of talking in jargon like scope 1 and scope 3 emissions and scope 2 emissions, which is the technical terms that we do to measure them, you can turn around and say our fuel use, and that essentially covers all of scope 1. Or we can say our supply chain footprint, which essentially covers all of scope 3. And then you could turn around and say our energy use, which covers scope 2. So it's using plain language to communicate what a business is doing in specific areas, and that avoids the confusion. And these standards and things, yeah, I mean, there's legislative standards out there, but you don't need to communicate exactly what, okay, AASB and ASRS, and there's all these things. But the output of that, and when you're communicating to customers, that means nothing. It's really just talking about what your business is doing in plain and simple language, and that is the best way to communicate it.
Perfect. And are there any simple frameworks or analogies that you use to help businesses understand their carbon footprint and reporting obligations?
Yeah, so if we think about finance, um, every business looks at finance at the end of the year. So you'll need to look at your balance sheet, and you'll need to look at a ledger, so your input, so your cost and your sales and your profits. And the analogy here is that carbon emissions and your emissions reporting and is essentially the same. It's saying, okay, well, we have all these activities. These are our inputs. The outputs are all these emissions associated with activities. What do we need to do with that? So we've got to try and keep it really simple. So it's input, output, report. So that's really as far as you need to think about it.
Pretty simple. Yep. And so I'd imagine that carbon reporting has a competitive advantage just beyond compliance as well. So how can businesses in the property sector use carbon reporting as a added advantage?
Yeah, we're seeing businesses use emissions reporting as a competitive advantage in a way that, and yet you've still got to be careful. But forward-thinking businesses tend to win more business, and they secure longer-term partnerships because what they're demonstrating is a process of understanding of the emissions of their organization, but then demonstrating how they're adapting by using low carbon materials, being more efficient in the build or the project in itself, having sustainability data available so their clients and customers can see what they're doing, and they're more attractive to investors. And some of the banks are now saying that part of the criteria in order to get any type of capital approval is you need to demonstrate you're participating in a climate program, and that could be either reporting or understanding your emissions or going through a process of reducing the emissions or adopting better materials. And we're finding that
Great.
in tenders, that's popping up quite a lot.
Awesome. That's a really good angle. Yep. And so, what are the risks for businesses that might delay or ignore these new requirements?
Yeah. Similar with the tenders, like having that advantage. If you don't do it, it's a disadvantage. There's a bigger risk of not actually getting uh, tenders awarded to you or getting access to
Mm,
projects. And a lot of contracts we're seeing are requiring emissions data up front. So if you're a late mover, there's two things that can happen. One is you don't do it and you don't want anything to do with it, and then you don't get the work. The other is you might end up rushing to try and get this done so you can win a tender, and then your compliance cost to do it goes up, because if you go out there in the market and you need it done within a short space of time, it's going to cost you a lot more than what it would be if you're doing this progressively over time.
yep. And planning ahead. Yep. Yep. And so, I guess thinking of, looking at your experience and thinking of the property sector, what would you say is the biggest challenge you see for property industry clients facing that they're facing when it comes to carbon reporting, and how would you guys help them overcome it in this?
Yeah, this isn't immune to just the um, construction or property or building industries. What we see the biggest challenge being is data collection, and being able to collect the right data to undertake the assessment is a really big thing. And to illustrate that, we do quite a number of different large clients that have multiple sites and multiple entities. And it can take sometimes 6 to 8 months for that business to collect the data that's needed for us to process the emissions assessment. And it's because some of these systems are so disparate that you've got to collect one piece from over here and another piece from over there, and then trying to collate them all. And even if you're adopting a tech enabled, or you're using a tech solution, you're still required to go and collect the data. There is no solution out there at this point that can scan through all your business, all of your um, different software, different quoting systems, this and that, and pull out all the information that's needed and produce a report for you.
Mm,
There's no system out there. There still needs to be, at this point, human involvement around collecting the right sets of data. And sure, there are tech platforms that might integrate with Xero or something like that for small business,
mm.
but still, the outputs from that are only going to be as good as the inputs that you've got in Xero.
Of course.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
So that is the biggest problem that most businesses face, is that data collection. And look, over time, particularly with the adoption of AI within the industry, automating that and having smarts behind classifying, categorizing, and defining where things aren't right, is going to get a lot simpler over time.
And I'm assuming once they've gathered all that data, it's just a once off project, although it might be tedious. It'd be a once off project, but then, a system that needs to be maintained ongoing from there. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So once you know where that data is, it's great to keep that in the repository. So, and that's where our system is built around, is keeping all of your climate and emissions related data in a centralized place. So you know where it is. If you know where that is, you know where you can look at historical data that you've input into the system and know where to go to get that. At the same time, you can build connectors around, okay, well, I got it from here to here. We can then link it.
Okay.
Over time, you'll
Okay.
be able to look at linking that data and using technology to help you bring in the information rather than manually collecting it.
Yeah. And I guess for anyone, any business starting out on their sustainability journey, well, you might have just answered this actually. What's the first thing that you'd advise them to do is gather your data, I suppose. But is there anything else?
Yeah, there's probably 5 steps, right? One is understand what your obligations are first. So determine whether you actually need to report or you don't need to report. If you're a smaller business and don't need to report, it still may be advantageous for you to do that internally, but also, as we mentioned, for potential of getting other work. Um, that's the first part, understanding your obligations, then looking to measure your emissions. And that can be done either through the three models that we discussed, and that can be either a tech platform, a consultant, or a hybrid type model. It'll suit different businesses for different applications. And once that's done, you then go about looking at developing a plan around how do I reduce those emissions and how do I demonstrate what I'm doing to my customers and be transparent about it. And each year you do that same thing each year.
Fantastic. That makes it so much more clear cut and easy to follow. Because I guess if you don't even need to be reporting, then you don't need to bother with all the rest of them. So it's good to clarify first.
Correct.
And fine. Sorry.
Correct. Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah. And I guess finally, if somebody wants to find out more about carbon emission reporting or Carbon Halo and what services you provide, what's the best way to get in touch with Carbon Halo?
Just going to our website at carbonhalo.com. On our website, you can book a discovery session, and it essentially is exactly what we talked about. It's defining whether you even meet the requirements. And if the answer is no, you don't meet the requirements, you have an option on whether you wanted to do something anyway. And as we mentioned, is that we have a free program for small businesses. So for those businesses that don't meet the requirements, they can still get onto the platform and do something, and it won't cost them a cent. So they can go ahead and do that. For businesses that do meet the requirements, we can then map them out, or essentially give them a roadmap of when they need to comply by and the things that they need to do. And then that way they can take that and they can run with it and do whatever they want with it, talk to us or talk to someone else. We do have regular webinars that walk through businesses on what their obligations are. We answer the most common questions that we come across. And yeah, just online, book a discovery session and all your questions can be answered through that system. Yeah.
And if somebody wants to attend the webinar, where would the links be for that? Is it an email that they need to sign up for, or is it LinkedIn or?
Yeah, so if we go onto our website and you sign up and subscribe to our newsletter, and then you wanted to book a discovery call, you'll get invites to those webinars. We normally hold them every month.
Yep.
So you can then elect to then register for one of those and find out for more information.
No worries. Look, Richie, that's been a wealth of information. I have to admit, when I first attended your webinar about a month ago, I was like, "What is all this about?" I have no idea, but I've learned a lot along the way, and I've certainly learned a lot through our conversation today. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, not a problem at all.
You've been listening to Foundations, a series that breaks down complex property and sustainability themes. I'm Amanda Paul, a specialised property copywriter who helps developers, suppliers and sustainability advocates create messaging that resonates and drives results. So if you're ready to be understood, remembered and chosen by your ideal buyer, let's talk.